I'm actually going to turn off my phone in front of everyone because I also need to be reminded, but if you want to check your phones and make sure they're off, so we can be immersed in the next hour and 15 minutes in a stimulating conversation about anti-Semitism in America. There have been scores of programs and panels on anti-Semitism in the last few months. Anyone in the audience been to one of them? Okay, so some of you have been to others. One of the things I've been noticing in going to these is that there hasn't been a lot of the historical perspective. So when we created a panel here and we started thinking about the kind of panel we wanted to have here, we're at the Center for Jewish History. I run the American Jewish Historical Society, and therefore I thought what would be appropriate here would be to talk about anti-Semitism in the framework of America and American history. So we've invited 3 of the foremost scholars of American Jewish history to engage in a conversation. We're also interested in your questions, and you might have noticed when you entered the room that there were sheets with little room for questions and pencils. So please, throughout the program, if a question occurs to you, we welcome you to write it down. This is just going to facilitate our ability to get to as many questions as possible. So at around 7:45 or so, several staff will be coming to collect the paper. So they'll be there. You'll kind of see them out of the corner of your eye, and you'll be able to pass your papers down. A quick word about the place we're in. The Center for Jewish History is the home of 5 collecting partners, YIVO, the Leo Baeck Institute, Yeshiva University Museum, the American Sephardi Federation, and my organization, the American Jewish Historical Society. Together, the archives here hold about 100 million documents, and I'm told that if you were to spread them out, you would get 5 miles, and I've never yet done that, and I can attest to the fact that our archivists do their job and they don't allow anyone to do that. But what we love to do more than anything is to be able to take the archives and the documents and the stories that are in these stacks. And there's a 12-story section of the building that are our stacks, and those 12 stories are filled with these boxes of documents. What we like to do in our programs, and also I should add that the scholars who are here tonight are scholars who have used these collections in their research. And our Scholars Lounge and our reading room is a wonderful place to do research. So the Center for Jewish History does a great job of serving the scholarly audience. But what we also like to do in our public programs is bring those documents and stories to you directly. And so tonight, we're actually going to root our analysis. We're going to begin the analysis of anti-Semitism in America by looking at one of the documents that is in our manuscript boxes. And the document you can see it as well. So in your head, you can start analyzing it before you even start to hear from our scholars. But this is from a collection we have called Anti-Semitic Literature. And it's one that AJHS staff over the years collected fragments of journals, sections of newspapers that testified in some way to anti-Semitism in America. And it's a very rich collection. And so I went to open one of these boxes, and the first thing I saw was this. And I thought this illustration, which comes from Judge magazine, which was a magazine that came out in the 1880s. And this particular image is entitled The Dreams of the Jews Realized. And it was done by a man named J.A. Wales. And again, it comes out in 1882. So what we did in advance is we sent this image to our panelists and our moderator to look at. And so they're going to actually begin the conversation by looking at a little bit of their interpretations of this image, which you can see as well. I'm just going to introduce our panelists and moderator, and I'll step out of the way so the important conversation can begin. So Lila Berman is one of our panelists. She's Associate Professor of History at Temple University. She is the author of Speaking of Jews, Rabbis, Intellectuals, and the Creation of an American Public Identity, and is currently completing a book called Jewish Urban Journeys Through an American City and Beyond. Her articles have appeared in the Journal of American History, Jewish Social Studies, American Jewish History, Religion and American Culture, The Forward, and Shema. And she's also the head of the executive board, the academic advisory board, that leads the American Jewish Historical Society, that works closely with it. As well, Tony Michaels is a member of that board as well. He is the George L. Massey Professor of American Jewish History at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, the best university in the world. His research focuses, I went there. His research focuses on the political and cultural history of the Jews. He is the author of A Fire in Their Hearts, Yiddish Socialists in New York. And he's also winner of the Salo Baron Prize from the American Academy for Jewish Research and Jewish Radicals, A Documentary History. I also want to make known that a relative of Salo Baron is in the audience tonight. I want to welcome Mr. Charles Knapp and thank him for being here, a wonderful supporter of American Jewish history. Dr. Jonathan D. Sarna is university professor, the Joseph H. and Bell R. Braun Professor of American Jewish History and director at the Schusterman Center for Israel Studies at Brandeis University. I could not possibly list all of his books, so I've just chosen American Judaism, which is a wonderful, comprehensive look at American history through the lens of religion. And also, appropriate for tonight's program, he wrote a book called When General Grant Expelled the Jews. He is a past president of the Association for Jewish Studies and chief historian of the National Museum of American Jewish History in Philadelphia. And I also want to welcome from Columbia University, Samuel G. Friedman, an American author and journalist, and a professor at the School of Journalism. He has authored 6 nonfiction books. His latest book is Breaking the Line, the season in black college football that transformed the sport and changed the course of civil rights. And he also writes the New York Times column on religion. And so he will be moderating this evening's event. So please join me in welcoming our moderator and panelists.
Welcome to you all, and thank you so much, Dr. Polland, for the introduction. I'll just add, I'm also an alumnus of the University of Wisconsin, so if there's a certain Wisconsin centrism up here, you'll know why. And I just want to start by adding a few more words to those from Dr. Polland. What we're trying to do tonight, even at a moment when resurgent anti-Semitism is so much in the news on an almost minute-by-minute basis in our 24-hour news cycle, is pull back and give some broader historical perspective to the American experience with anti-Semitism. That's one reason why we're starting with this visualization of it, and it's one reason we're going to try to keep looking for the lessons of history or the cautionary tales of history throughout the evening to try to bring maybe something less heard in the current discourse to bear. As Dr. Polland said, what we've asked our panelists to do initially is to reflect on this particular image, this particular anti-Semitic cartoon of about 125, 130 years ago, and derive some lessons for today from it. I'll also just add that in the hope that we can keep the ball moving around here and have lots of time for our panelists to interact with each other even before we open it to questions, I'll ask each of our panelists to try to speak for no more than 5 minutes initially, and we'll have plenty of more time for follow-up questions and for their own responses to each other. So I'll ask first Dr. Berman, then Dr. Sarna, then Dr. Michaels. We'll go in that order and then open it wide.
Well, thanks so much, all of you, for showing up tonight and deciding to devote your evening to talking about anti-Semitism, which is, not necessarily what everybody is so eager to talk about, and yet the situation presents itself. And I think, in particular, I would say, anyway, for those of us who do American Jewish history, I'll speak personally, have felt a huge sense of disorientation. And maybe one would think, well, if you study American Jewish history, you should really know how to think about the world today and all the different incidents of anti-Semitism and the spike in anti-Semitism that we're witnessing. And in a sense, I would say quite to the contrary, that I think my field has not actually done much critical thinking about anti-Semitism. And I think that's because we have really leaned into a particular narrative about American success and American progress. And that's something that I'm really interested in exploring today on this stage with the colleagues I really admire most in my field. Did we miss really thinking about the sweep of American Jewish history in the right way? Do we need to reassess some of the narratives and truths, especially about progress and about success, that we have held so dear in my field? So to think about this image, first of all, when I first saw it, I was with Annie, and we were looking at this collection that is, I think, 38 linear feet of what I, in my head, and now I'll tell you, call Anti-Semitica. And it is really incredible to me, not only this as a historical artifact, but its context, that there were various people who were collecting and clipping this kind of art and these kinds of artifacts and creating a collection of them and curating them as a way to really think about what does anti-Semitism mean in the United States, but I would say also as a way to put a certain boundary on it, as if it can be held in these archival boxes and sort of collected, organized, cataloged, and in that sense rationalized and dealt with. And in many ways, I think that that echoes a lot of the ways that the American Jewish sort of institutional and established community has tried to deal with anti-Semitism in the United States, to create a kind of rational narrative for fighting it, for thinking of it as really an individual pathology that one can be educated away from. So when I look at this image, one thing that is immediately striking to me is it does not show hordes of immigrants, of poor people flowing into the United States in the late 19th century and contesting, a kind of middle-class ideal. This image is about what, we might think of as the creative destruction of capitalism. So we have an audience sitting here, and I don't know how well you can see all the different details, but there's an audience here that is, I think, clearly being signified as Jewish, with kind of caricatured noses, but a nouveau riche or bourgeois kind of audience to this performance of the literal signs of change as the old signs marking the established families of New York City with names like Smith are being taken down, and what I think you maybe can't see is that the new signs that are being put in place are signs with Jewish names. So this is really about a kind of populist anxiety of the late 19th century about capitalism and about who is controlling that process of destroying the old and creating the new. And so it's not anxiety about immigration necessarily. It's not anxiety that later, at the end of the century and the beginning of the 20th century, will become much more present. But it's really this kind of trope of Jews being involved in destroying certain modes of transaction and of relationship and orchestrating new modes of them. And in that regard, it is a long-standing kind of trope about control and about conspiracy. So I find that interesting. And I think the last thing I'll say, because probably my time is just about up, I find it interesting as well that in my field of American Jewish history, one of the celebrated narratives that I have certainly been part of has to do with talking about the effect that Jews have had on American cities. And, all of the ways that Jews have been real estate developers and builders and architects and artists and just the engines of creating American urbanism. And yet here, in a sense, is that same kind of image of the Jew recreating the city, but with this real underbelly of suspicion and of concern about the kind of power that Jews are wielding in this kind of creative destruction of capitalism.
So, first of all, let me also thank the American Jewish Historical Society for creating this panel and for bringing us together. And to me, there's a certain irony in the fact that we're here talking about American Jewish history. I really began my career thinking about American anti-Semitism. The very first work I did in American Jewish history was an effort in my senior year in high school to write a history of American anti-Semitism. It was also my first visit to the American Jewish Historical Society, which in those days was on the Brandeis campus. I know that collection of ephemera. And then when I actually made that my career, some of my early work was on American anti-Semitism, which was a subject much discussed in the late 1970s, early 1980s. This was a moment when black anti-Semitism had surprised Jews by bursting onto the scene. People didn't understand it, and it is a moment when there was a lot of work on the history of American anti-Semitism. And I would say that then and later, there were really three schools of anti-Semitism. There are the maximalists. Anti-Semitism, say they, has been from the beginning to the present in America. We've covered it up. America is not different from Europe. And anti-Semitism runs through from the colonial period to the present. Then there are minimalists. Yes, there have been isolated incidents, moments when the subject has come to the fore, but actually many other kinds of prejudice are much more significant in America. Anti-Semitism has been a minor factor. Indeed, were one to go through the publications of the American Jewish Historical Society, those publications reaching back to the 1890s, one actually sees only the very first articles on anti-Semitism in America beginning near the end of World War II. And then in the 50s, when there is a big discussion of, relevant to our day, of whether the populists, those late 19th century left-wing political movement, whether they were anti-Semitic. And then you have a centrist. You have the maximalists, the minimalists. You have the centrists. I'll say now, I see myself as a centrist. You neither should exaggerate American anti-Semitism by saying, America is not different. There were several books that came out in the 1980s. It could have happened here, it being the Holocaust. That's the maximalist position. I think a centrist says, yeah, there's been anti-Semitism. It runs through the course of history. I do not think that is American Jewish history. Now this, let me turn to this document, fascinating. Its date is 1882, as you heard. It's from The Judge. There were really two magazines, important ones, that had comics, that had these kinds of cartoons. One was Puck, the most famous, and that tended to be more sympathetic to Jews and not sympathetic to anti-Semites. A man named Kepler did a lot of those. And then you had really a man known for his anti-Semitism, James Albert Wales, who is this cartoonist. There are several, even worse. He has a cartoon called The Slaves of the Jews in there. Now, what is going on here, I think you heard a wonderful description of it. What's fascinating to me about it, this in 1882, with a rise of Jewish immigration following pogroms in 1881, which followed the assassination of Alexander II of Russia. There's a big uptick in immigration, a lot of discussion about Jewish immigration to New York, and Jews are staying in New York. And what do you hear? We hear in this cartoon The Jews will not replace us. That's really what this is about. It is showing the Jews are replacing us, and of course his message was the Jews will not replace us. That fear, you can trace a straight line from 1882 to Charlottesville. It's the same language, the same fear, and that's what we mean. We are seeing the return of historical tropes. The Jews will not replace us. Rothschild, Jewish power, and other tropes that need to be understood historically and have to be understood cyclically. They rise and fall through American history.
So what I see in this document is something that is a distinctly modern theme in anti-Semitism, and that is this theme of Jewish domination. It's modern because it is a moment in time, the second half of the 19th century, when Jews in the United States and Europe have achieved integration, barriers have fallen, and they're entering into spheres of society in which they didn't exist before in appreciable numbers. Now they are, whether it's the law or we're talking about certain neighborhoods, intellectual life, the professions generally, we can go down the list. Jews are ever more present. And so I want to stress here, in keeping with this question, that I don't think this is uniquely American or uniquely European. This seems to be a modern phenomenon in various democratic societies in which Jews have achieved emancipation, equal civil and political rights. So that's one, this anxiety about what will happen to society now that Jews are equal, at least equal in the eyes of the law. Jews are going to take over. They're rushing in, they're dominating. So there's an inability to distinguish between integration and domination. The people who shared these fears can't distinguish between the two. If Jews are present in any significant numbers, they must be taking over. Now, I will say one thing, and this points to a difficulty in analyzing anti-Semitism, that is that there is some reality to this. The fact of the matter is, Jews in the 19th century are moving up into society in achieving in various ways. It's what Jewish historians celebrate, actually, are the achievements of Jews in the sciences and the arts and business and so forth. So something that Jewish historians and the anti-Semites can agree on is that something important is happening in the 19th century, and Jews are leaving the ghettos, so to speak. They're moving into society, and society's changing by their presence, right? The anti-Semites say that, society's changing. The difference is Jewish historians say this is for the good, and anti-Semites have a different valence. Right? This is bad when you have Jews in numbers that are too large. It's bad for society. It's bad for culture. It's bad for the dominant values. But again, what makes this difficult is that you have Jewish historians and anti-Semites agreeing on a couple of these things. That Jews are moving into society. That has ramifications for the society at large, and then they diverge on what they make of the phenomena both are the phenomena that both are observing.
Dr. Berman, you talked about the events in Charlottesville really shattering a certain triumphalist, American exceptionalist narrative about Jews. Dr. Sarna, you talked about the waxing and waning, the cyclical nature. So in different ways you're expressing a similar thought, which is that there are these high and low watermarks of public expressions of anti-Semitism. So the question, historically speaking, I'd like to throw out to all three of you, and we can go in that same sequence. And again, that 5-minute rule worked so well, we'll try to do it again, is to what degree does the waxing and waning reflect external forces that provoke or catalyze more expressions of anti-Semitism at some times than at others? And to what degree is it more a matter of social permission, that the attitudes are always there, that the variable in the equation is rather a sense that it's socially acceptable to express them?
It's a good question. So I'm not certain that I'm convinced of the cyclical quality, and I'll explain why. Although I think it's absolutely the case that, for example, if we look at the late 19th century, we can see patterns from the late 19th century that resonate with some of the experiences that, we're having right now in thinking about anti-Semitism. I think that there are so many shifts in context. And so it's not clear to me, really, that we should just simply expect that there are these cycles. And this was sort of the theory of a guy named John Hyam, who wrote about nativism and then anti-Semitism after World War II. And he argued exactly this, that there are these cycles and that there are times when nativism and xenophobia and racism will increase, and often that has to do with economic insecurity and, a number of other factors, and then it will wane, and slowly but surely things will sort of inch ahead toward progress with maybe a couple steps back but a few more steps forward. And I think that a problem with that is sort of the assumption that, in a sense, history is just always on this sort of cycle of progress, even in that kind of cyclical way. So it's actually not clear to me that that's really the most powerful way to think about this. I am much more interested in the different kinds of contextual factors. And I think that one of the contextual factors that American Jewish historians have not really paid much attention to, Tony was saying that in the late 19th century, the kind of problem of modernity for Jews was the problem of being emancipated, right? Which was all sorts of opportunities to have civic and political equality. And with it came challenges to how to maintain some sense of Jewishness and what it meant actually in form to become part of a mainstream host society, whatever term you want to use. And in the United States, there was sort of an assumption that Jews didn't have to undergo a process of becoming emancipated, that when they came to the United States, they received citizenship. And this has been sort of the nub of how historians argue and answer this question, that yes, America is different, because whereas in Europe it was this long, extended, and difficult process of really, never, in many cases, achieving full emancipation. In the United States, it was something that Jews had more or less upon arrival. And I think what this means is that we have missed seeing some of the legal and political structures that in the late 19th century, in the beginning of the 20th century, and onward, have actually been embedded in various systems of oppression that make it actually not an accident and not just a cyclical thing, that anti-Semitism, it sort of comes and it goes, and sometimes it's socially acceptable to say that you have prejudices against various people, and sometimes it's not. But I think that we actually can look at different legal and political factors having to do with employment practices, having to do with public accommodations, having to do with education, and think about these full systems of oppression that have been so important to how the United States functions, and that lead me to not actually be certain, A, that these cycles exist, and B, that the answer to the question, is America different, should necessarily be yes.
So when I teach this material, I try and help students look at three lenses. We can certainly look at the Jewish lens. The number of Jews is growing. There's concern about that. This is actually the moment, we're in New York, when New York overtakes Warsaw as the largest Jewish community in the world. So we can look at a Jewish lens. We can also look at an American lens. It's not just anti-Semitism that's growing. Little known and almost unstated in all of the discussions of anti-Semitism is the fact that the word anti-Semitism comes into existence at almost the same moment and for many of the same reasons as Jim Crow legislation comes in. We're in a moment of scientific racism, social Darwinism. the great liberalism, all of the optimism of the 1870s. There is a journal, AJ just owns some volumes, called The New Era by a rabbi. He couldn't have been more optimistic in the early 1870s. And then it all comes crashing down, as shocking to young people in the late 1870s and early 1880s as it is in the early 21st century to young people who had all sorts of beliefs in progress and saw it coming down. But that's the second lens, is America. And of course, then there's the third lens, which is look worldwide. And you look worldwide and you see it's not just America. This was the Dreyfus affair in France. You see a great rise, think Treitschke, in anti-Semitism in Germany, where the very word anti-Semitism, hatred of Jews based on their race rather than by their religion, is founded. So it's not that one of those lenses is better than the other any more than a microscope is better than a telescope or vice versa. Each lens, the global lens, the national lens, the Jewish lens, looks at this in a different way and draws different insights. I do think, I would not want you to imagine that cycles, the Almighty sits and pushes a button and says, well, time to go back the other way. No. In the late 19th century, America is fast changing. The number of Jews is growing. The number of Catholics is growing. It's no longer Protestant America. And in the early 21st century, America is changing. The number of Hispanics is growing. The number of Muslims is growing. It's no longer Judeo-Christian America. Those moments, often fueled by vast worldwide migrations. The late 19th century sees an unprecedented worldwide migration, of which the Jewish migration is part. And in our day, we are seeing, partly due to climate change, vast worldwide migrations transforming all aspects of the world, including leading people from Latin America, where there are no jobs, to North America in hope of saving their lives and getting opportunities. And similarly, worldwide migrations out of Arab lands. So the parallels are there. And one of the things that historians can do is look at earlier moments when similar things happen. It doesn't mean history always repeats itself, but it helps us to understand the present moment because we no longer think it's unique or unprecedented. And we also have the optimistic sense that history is not necessarily either going to continue in a straight line or move upward. It's complicated. The late 19th, early 20th century anti-Semitism gives way to a new liberalism in the 50s, the 60s, and conditions for Jews greatly improve. Then there are ups and downs. But today, anybody who looks at the Jewish situation honestly knows that for all of the difficulties, the place of Jews in America is infinitely stronger than it was in the 20s and 30s. And so it seems to me it's not a matter of using history to say, oh, nothing's changed. It's using history to shed light on contemporary changes. And at least for me, this cartoon in the late 19th century helps us to understand a lot about what we've seen in our own time.
I'll speak to this question of cycles. I would say I'd also speaking on the subject or the question of cycles. Is anti-Semitism cyclical? My own perspective is it's not. I'd frame it this way: anti-Semitism appeared as a significant phenomenon in American society in the 1870s. In any case, since the Civil War, I'd say it grew from decade to decade up until the 1940s. In that period, anti-Semitism, meaning discrimination, prejudice, and even violence against Jews, grew in its frequency, its scope. It affected Jews across class boundaries. It affected Jews across, what's the right word here? Generations, which is to say native-born and immigrant. It affected Jews from Central Europe and Eastern Europe, right? In all these ways, Jews faced mounting anti-Semitism. It didn't decline precipitously until World War II and the anti-fascist crusade that made anti-Semitism disreputable. And then I'd say after World War II, there was an extended period from, let's say, the late 40s to, I would say, the early 21st century. That would be my periodization, in which anti-Semitism became disreputable quite fast. Well, certainly by the late 1950s, it had receded quite a bit. And there was an extended period in which Jews enjoyed a greater level of acceptance than ever before. I think now in the 21st century, this has changed. And so as I say, I don't see cycles, I see eras. And the era of anti-Semitism that increased only came to an end in the fight against fascism. That could be a cause of optimism. It could lead one to different conclusions, but that's how I'd see it. Now, I'd say where Jews differ, what makes the experience of Jews with anti-Semitism different from their contemporaries who came from Europe, is that, and here I'll invoke John Hyam, who's come up more than once already, is that unlike European immigrants, who experienced some level of bigotry that then receded as they became more Americanized, integrated, and so forth, the opposite actually happened with Jews, particularly in the pre-World War II era. As Jews became more Americanized, as they became more successful, they faced greater barriers. So anti-Semitism grew, again, to reiterate what I said before, across time among different, and affected different segments of the Jewish population. That's a difference. And we see this difference today. Irish Americans aren't attacked. Italian Americans aren't attacked. We don't hear Polish jokes anymore. And we can go on down the list. It's Jews and only Jews of the group that came to America in large numbers between the 1820s and 1920s that encounter persistent forms of anti-Semitism. So I think we're talking then again, so just to kind of sum up what I'm saying, a certain uniqueness about anti-Semitism or Jewish experience, not that Jews alone face discrimination or the most forms of discrimination. They don't. They don't and they don't. But the persistence of the phenomenon of a group who came to the United States at the same time many others did from Europe, that makes it anti-Semitism unique. And the second, again, my first point is that I don't see cycles, but again, eras in which we have an increase in anti-Semitism, a fairly sharp decline, and now a return that almost no one anticipated 15 years ago.
I want to throw out one more question for our panelists, and I think after they've been able to chew over it, then hopefully we'll have some questions coming up because I want to preserve some time for your questions. One of the things that flows through the observations, particularly that Dr. Michaels and Dr. Sarna just made, is the compare and contrast factor between the bigotries visited upon Jews as immigrants and bigotries visited on, as you said, Italian Catholics, Irish Catholics, Polish Catholics, etc. To look in a somewhat different way, but also for a compare and contrast, we're in a moment now when public calumnies, public hatreds are being expressed against Jews and also against Muslims, against Latinos, against gays, against women, a whole variety of versions of hatred are afoot and abroad in the land. To what degree does anti-Semitism bear likening to these forms, racism and the others, and to what degree is it different, and how so?
It's a big question.
I'm trying to ask good ones. I don't want to waste time on bad
No,
ones.
right, that is. So I see all of these kinds of oppressions that you just mentioned as connected, right? I mean, I think it's clear that there are connections, that there are threads that connect all of these different forms of oppression. And I don't think that they're threads necessarily about, individual psychology, although that could be, but I think it's even more so about how our own society and the kind of modern economic and political and social organization of this country has been dependent upon forms of oppression, right? And so, I think we see this most clearly when we think about racism in this country, right? Which is not an anomaly. It is not an exception, right? It is very much at the heart of the American project. Which is not to say it's the only facet of the American project, but it was there from the beginning, and it's part of the economic fiber of our country. And one of the reason I think that it is so persistent is because actually to dismantle it would require dismantling most of the systems that our country works through. And so I think that so many of these other forms of oppression start to kind of weave into that same system. And so a lot of the kinds of efforts, if we think of that post-World War II period, right, when Tony talked about this, real kind of precipitous decline in anti-Semitism, the way that Jewish organizations and other organizations talked about fighting hatred in the United States after World War II was really about a kind of individual level of education. It was about people learning how to work together on teams. It was about brotherhood, and a language that, really the issue with racism and with anti-Semitism and with hatred of the other was an individual one. And that individuals had to sort of cure themselves from this pathology, and there could be education and there could be trainings to help people do that, and then people could work together and they could be productive. And I think that kind of coaxed many people into believing and into telling a narrative that indeed would be what was going to kind of root out hatred in the United States. These kinds of individual efforts of tolerance, of, teaching people how to appreciate one another. And what it really means is that, in a sense, and one of my students is in the audience, and you'll know I'm talking about this book that we talked about today. What it means is that, in a sense, civility won out over equality. And I really think that has been kind of a pattern that we see from that post-war period, where we learned that the right way to deal with these forms of oppression had to do with being civil to one another and being tolerant of one another, and that those kinds of anti-fascist movements that had been afoot in the 1930s, that had been afoot in the 1940s, that had in many ways been talking about new economic models that had to do with equality, that had to do with the redistribution of resources in ways that would give people all sorts of access to opportunity in different ways. A lot of that faded in the anti-communist period of the post-war era, and I think that we focused a lot more on sort of the individual and this kind of liberal idea of civility. And I think that's really where, in a sense, we have been unable to see these systems operating together because we sort of moved toward this more individual model of civility.
So first, let's note an irony. We've talked about John Hyam. We've just talked with civility about Cudahy. Neither was Jewish, and they viewed anti-Semitism differently. And there are not many such scholars who worked on Jews who were not within the group. But it also reminds us of something very important, and that is, we're here talking about anti-Semitism. There is an equally powerful and important tradition of philo-Semitism in America that one can similarly trace from the colonial period all the way to the present. People who loved Jews, who saw that Jews were central to their redemption, who were excited about the coming of the Jews, who viewed Jews as the people of the Bible. And there is a tension, as there is today, between philo-Semitism and anti-Semitism, sometimes a thin line between them, and of course the paradox of our day, where there's so many Jews at the center of power, and who would have imagined that you'd have an election where it didn't matter who won? Both of them had Jewish son-in-laws, and that didn't hurt them. One pundit called it the Battle of the Machatonim. Someone I can see, someone making fun of the very idea of anti-Semitism when you have such powerful Jews in America. And yet we know it exists, but it's important to realize that both traditions are present. Jews have long believed that where there is hatred in America, there will be hatred of Jews. John Hyam pointed that out too, that Jews, and that's why Jews were so active in fighting for civil rights, in fighting for women's rights, and in battling hatred of all kinds, because they believe today it's them, tomorrow it's us. And it was easy to show when that happened. Louis Marshall, when they first limited Asian immigrants to America, said, this is the beginning, and then they will limit Jews. And that turned out, actually, from the 1880s to 1924, largely to be correct. There were lessons there. That's what Jews believe, and that's why Jews have acted against hatred of all kinds. I tend to think, as I say, I'm not interested in whether they are cyclical eras or we're not talking the stock market. Of course, hatred rises and falls, and eras of change often lead to the growth of hatred. But I think it would be a great mistake to forget the other aspect of America. It's not really true, I think, that it was a linear up after the Civil War. One is hard-pressed from 1865 to 1877. That generation, they thought it was a new era. They were so excited about changes in American life. And that's why they were so devastated. And in our own time, you had a generation that believed that anti-Semitism, if it ever existed in America, certainly didn't exist today. Only people of color suffer from hate in America, not Jews. Almost nothing has been written about anti-Semitism in the scholarly literature for about 15 years. And enrollments in classes on the subject went down and down, and then suddenly it comes up. But I'm willing to imagine that if America calms down and as we get used to a different America, that again we'll see a decline, and that's the way the history has moved. The thing I think is, I agree, there are long delay and kind of short intervals, and that's like the economy. But if we think about anti-Semitism the way we think about the economy, yes, there are recessions, there are periods of great economic growth, and so on. Then we understand the nature of anti-Semitism, and we understand why, even though I know it sounds old-fashioned. I'm the oldest of the group, I think, so I can be old-fashioned to talk about cycles. Yeah, economists still appreciate cycles, and we, those in this audience who've lived a while, know about economic cycles, and there's much that can be learned from economics that actually applies well to what we know about the rise and fall of anti-Semitism as well.
So before I get to your question, I'll just clarify something I didn't actually come out and say, but implied. What I meant to say is that the post-war period may turn out to be the exception in American history, meaning that the decline of anti-Semitism that was so clear in the decades after World War II might not be part of a shift in eras or cycles, but an aberration in American history, and that what I can imagine existing. And is the mail coming?
No. We're going to take a sample.
Oh, sample.
We're not going to do them all.
So what I can imagine is that for the foreseeable future, anti-Semitism will simply be part of the American landscape. And again, so we look back at an earlier period, the post-war period, and not see it as a cycle or a shift or an era, but again, an exception. An exception caused by by one catastrophe, Nazism and its defeat, and second, by an unprecedented growth in the American economy. Those two things happen simultaneously, and again, they might appear to be, in retrospect, the exception. In response to Sam's question about the similarities or differences between anti-Semitism and other forms of discrimination, racism, bigotry, and so forth, there are many ways to answer the question. I think the one, I'll just respond in reference to something that's been on my mind a lot lately and has agitated me a lot, if it doesn't sufficiently answer your question. And that is one thing that might be specific to Jews, is the fact that anti-Semitism, or dislike of them, comes from the political right and the left now in American history. Historically, the left has not been a source of anti-Semitism in America. It's actually been a kind of refuge from it and a bulwark against it. You can't say that, I think, now in the 21st century. And I don't think there's any other group, I could be wrong because I'm thinking to some degree off the top of my head, that faces dislike, prejudice, bigotry from both ends of the political spectrum. That may be a uniqueness about anti-Semitism.
All right, we have wonderful questions. I'm going to start by reading a couple that cover similar ground, and there are even another two or three that I'm not going to get to, but that also raised similar issues. So I'll read a couple of these, and then whichever panelist in whatever order would like to answer them. First one, there's been no mention of Israel Zionism as a new factor, new underlined a couple of times, a new factor in growing anti-Semitism. The next one, excuse me, if anti-Semitism has gotten worse in the 21st century, what role has attitudes towards Israel played in triggering that, or has renewed anti-Semitism triggered rage against Israel? And as I said, there are a couple of other questions that reflect similar concerns.
Sir? Okay.
You go first. I'm happy to do it. Yeah. Go.
So Israel's a factor. Certainly it's a factor. A factor meaning Israel is a focal point of expressions of anti-Semitism. It's such a complicated phenomenon. I'm not sure I can say anything pithy here, but maybe let me just interject this and leave it, turn the conversation over to others. Sometimes people say what makes Israel a new factor is that it's a situation in which Jews have state power. And so it makes it difficult to discern what's a critique of a government that could be made of any number of governments and what is anti-Semitic. Let me just say that for historical perspective, Israel might not be so new or unique a factor in this. And I'm thinking of the Russian Revolution. And that's an instance where many people thought this was a form of Jewish political power, that communism was a kind of Jewish plot. The revolution wouldn't have happened were it not for the Jews. And so to attack communism, in some people's minds, meant to attack Jews. You had to. But that wasn't anti-Semitism, the anti-communists, or this kind of anti-communist said. This is a identification of Jews not singling them out, shining a spotlight on Jews for the crimes they commit as communists. So you take someone like Charles Coughlin, Father Coughlin, one of the most notorious anti-Semites. He said, I'm not an anti-Semite, I'm an anti-communist. Just so happens that Jews are responsible for communism. And so if Jews don't want to be disliked, what they should do is take responsibility for what's going on in Moscow and try to stop it. That, Charles Coughlin's statement is not entirely different from what some anti-Zionists say about Israel. We're not criticizing the Jews. We're criticizing the unethical exercise of power by Jews, and maybe Jews should do the ethical thing and start criticizing Israel. There are differences between Coughlin and this kind of anti-Zionist, but I think at least for the sake of for discussion, they're worth talking about. And that brings us back to the original point here. Is Israel a new factor or not? Because we're talking about a political phenomenon, not these kinds of things we see here. Again, I'm not so sure.
So I think this is an interesting moment behind us, because that was the moment when we moved from hatred of Jews based on religion to hatred of Jews based on race. No, sure, we're all very liberal on religion. It's really about race. Of course, anybody who reads the anti-Semitic, note the racial term, literature knows that lurking beneath it were old anti-Jewish stereotypes that had been repackaged in race. Well, then we move forward, and, we're not anti-Semitic. We don't believe in race. But then you had Holocaust denial. And, well, that's just a scholarly disagreement. But if you actually read the literature of Holocaust denial, then it was full of the old anti-Jewish tropes repackaged in a Holocaust denial, a kind of outer dress. And so it is with much of anti-Zionism. Well, we can't attack you on the basis of religion or race, and Holocaust denial is discredited. We can get you on the basis of Israel. And many of the tropes, the notion of Israel's power, the notion that Israel is responsible for every evil act that goes on in the world, is no different really than the elders of Zion, Zion, who believed that Jews manipulated all of those levers. You just pushed in one or the other. That is not to say that every criticism of Israel is a manifestation of anti-Semitism, but singling out Israel out of all proportion very often is really a modern form of anti-Semitism redressed re-dressed in order to make it seem acceptable. And what is so fascinating, really, is how many of the traditional tropes about Jewish power have now been kind of pushed on to the anti-Zionist, the anti-Zionist left that has taken really that over. So, in that respect, I think it's both new and not very new there. And remember, it goes back to our period here. For a long time, Jews were cursed. Jews are weak. Jews are punished for that terrible crime of deicide. And then in a very short time, we have the opposite. Jews are powerful. Jews control the world. Jews are both revolutionaries and bankers. Really astonishing. And the inner contradictions tell you very little about Jews and very much about the people who hate the Jews. And I think that much of that is true about Israel today. This on the stage might disagree in who we support to be in the Israeli elections, but I don't think that's what we're talking about. We're really talking about people who utterly out of proportion view Israel as a demonic force the way they used to view Jews as a demonic force.
It's not required, but would you like to address it?
I think the one thing that I will say that's maybe a little bit different is that when we think historically about the development of Zionism, it has a history that is itself entangled with ideas about anti-Semitism. And in fact, Zionists, who were not a monolithic group, right? They had many, many different views about what Zionism meant. Did it mean territory? Did it mean something that was not necessarily a modern form of the nation state? Debated about the role of anti-Semitism in Zionism. And I think that one of the complications then of thinking about the relationship between Zionism and anti-Semitism is that certain formulations of Zionism pivoted upon the notion of a kind of eternalist variety of anti-Semitism, that what justifies Zionism is the very fact that there always will be anti-Semitism. And I think that, just interpretively then, to try to understand what is the relationship between Zionism and anti-Semitism, there's this historical kind of entanglement. And I think as well that the current state of Israel and the elected officials at this moment are quite aware of that and use it in a certain way, right? When we know that Netanyahu, after violent incidents in France a few years ago, basically said, now you all should come, now all you Jews should come to Israel, right? We've been saying forever that you can't really have appropriately healthy Jewish life in the diaspora. I think that the way in which then Zionism itself sort of, in certain instances anyway, replicates the language or the discourse of anti-Semitism makes it a much more complicated issue than even, some of what we've already heard.
But Zionism changes the equation because indeed Jews have that option. Zionism changes the equation because Jews for the first time have that option. I find, and we all are teachers, what we all saw on television, all of those Syrians and nobody wants to take them in, and suddenly my students understood, oh, that's why we needed an Israel, because in the 1930s, that was us. And we needed a place where if you were persecuted, they took you in. And if there is a difference between the anti-Semitism of the earlier era and the anti-Semitism of today, it's that there is a Jewish state. And yes, even American Jews know, if indeed there has been the turn that you're worried about, well, there's an option. And I wish we had taken a poll of how many Jews had a conversation soon after the last election that they never thought in their lifetime they would have. And that conversation was, maybe the game's over and we should think about moving to Israel. Well, that option is available now, but wasn't available before.
Okay. I want to go to another question that reflects the sentiment in several others, because this may be the last question we have time for.
Glad we've solved the problem.
I know. Well, no, it's, it's just our version of the Jewish postcard. Start worrying, details to follow. In the 1920s, it's not my joke, I just remember. In the 1920s, F. Scott Fitzgerald wrote about the prevalent white supremacist ideology, and it seemed that the momentum reached such a level that a Nazi gathering took place in New York City's Madison Square Garden. By the way, there was a documentary
right.
just the other night and just nominated for an Oscar about that. In any case, the question continues. The 1940s saw the deadly results. Do you believe that in another 2 decades that this will usher in another tragic set of events here or anywhere else?
So I guess I should start on the other one as it's gone first. So number one, it's always good for Jews to be nervous. When Jews or any group get complacent, that's bad. Number two, I'm much more worried about Jews being loved to death in this country than anti-Semitism being the end of Jews. When we're honest, look how many people today view Judaism as part of some heritage that their grandparents had. We should be much larger people than we are. And America has been unkind to small minorities who assimilate out of existence. New York has various Huguenot churches. There used to be more Huguenots than Jews. Those are French Calvinists expelled from the Edict of Nantes. Many more Huguenots than Jews. They intermarried out of existence. The Zoroastrians, the Greeks, all nervous. I'm much more worried about that. That said, always good for Jews to be nervous, but do remember, first of all, in America, we've always been able to fight back freely. And we've done so, back from Chaim Solomon in the Revolution. And second of all, there are all sorts of forms of animus. We've talked about anti-Catholicism, of course, terrible racism, anti-German feelings, anti-Muslim feelings, anti-Quaker feelings. We're very pluralistic in our hatreds in America. But in most of the world, Jews in Europe were the only outgroup. And the third thing to remember is that actually hatred, I continue to believe, is much more foreign to American ideals than it was in much of Europe. In Europe, conservatives could point to the good old days when Jews knew their place and when they were restricted. And so it is in much of the Arab world, where people remember where Jews were legally second-class citizens. Well, it's hard to look at the American Constitution or at the Founding Fathers or at our great heroes, look at Lincoln, and say, in those days, Jews knew their place. To the contrary, in those days, they were excited about the American experiment where there wouldn't be religious persecution. Where it wouldn't just be toleration. That's George Washington. It's not just toleration that is spoken of, but it really is equality of rights, and that those rights are rooted in natural law. So I do think that the better angels of our nature, as Abraham Lincoln called them, will again surface in America. And while I think it's good for Jews to be nervous, I think it would be important for us not to give up on the America that so many of us have believed in for our whole life.
So I disagree. And I guess I'll get booed.
That's what panel discussions are for.
Okay. So am I worried that in 20 years it's going to be the same as Nazism or the Holocaust? No, but I am really deeply worried about nationalism. And I am really, and that's why I'm worried as well about Zionism. And that's why I certainly was not somebody having a conversation after Trump was elected saying maybe we should move to Israel. because I think that the problems that we're seeing in this country having to do with white nationalism, which is not a new force, but which has come out in the open and has become an animating force of American nationalism and an animating force of American policy. I think that those problems of nationalism we're seeing in lots of other countries that are embracing a kind of hyper-nationalist moment. I don't have any way of knowing which groups will experience the most fallout from that. But I do know, however, that there have been groups already in our country who have experienced massive fallout because of forces of nationalism and because of the ways in which those kinds of forces of nationalism have sidelined conversations about equality. So I am personally incredibly worried about the fact that we have an administration in power that seems to feel very, very comfortable invoking a form of separatist white nationalism. And I am worried about other countries throughout Europe, throughout the rest of the world, and including Israel, though not Israel alone, that seem to also be thinking that this is the way that the world should work. Because I think that if we move forward in that way, as I said, there are going to be groups that will not be able to sort of be sustained, right? That you know, this kind of very separatistic, isolationist kind of impulse, I don't see our Constitution saving us. So, sorry.
So instead of attempting a prediction about how things could go terribly wrong for Jews in the coming decades, I'll say four things I'm worried about America. It seems to me that the American economy is highly volatile, and it seems to me it's incapable of providing economic security to all of its citizens, maybe not even the majority of its citizens. So that's one thing that worries me. The second thing that worries me is the pervasiveness of a kind of a Christian fundamentalism that, among other problems you can imagine it poses for Jews, points to the fragmentation of America because of its separatist nature. And it contributes to I worry that Christian fundamentalism contributes to a fragmentation of the country. Of this country. That's number two. I'd say number three is that I think there is a deterioration of values in this country that I'm not sure is reparable. It might be, but it might not be. The values meaning the civic republican values that have been very important for the better aspects of the American character to prevail in difficult times. I'm not sure this exists anymore, and the reason why I say that it exists, I'm not sure it will prevail for two reasons. One, the forces that brought Trump to power I view as a repudiation of conservatism. The conservatism itself, which previously was preoccupied with the preservation of values, institutions, and continuities of traditions, has basically been rendered politically impotent. That worries me. Liberalism, the more progressive variant of conservatism, which is also, in other words, concerned with the preservation of the American constitutional order and the values needed to perpetuate democratic institutions in this country, has also been battered to such an extent that it can't perform the work of holding the country's democratic institutions together. So I'm worried about values. And it seems to me, again, that the conservatism is dead and liberalism is in trouble, and I'm not sure there's a way out of it. And I say that because there's a president who opposes all these things. That is unprecedented. So I'm worried, at least by these three developments in this country. What these develop, and I don't view these developments, by the way, as recent aberrations. I think they have deep-seated roots in this country, at least to I would say 1968, when George Wallace ran for president. And I'm not sure, we don't know. I don't think anyone can fairly say whether there will be a correction and what we see now will be balanced out by something better, return to America's democratic traditions or not. If we don't, then I think all minorities have reason to worry about their lives in America.
Well, on that appropriately Jewish note of Mishigas and Suris, I'd like to bring our wonderful panel discussion to a close, and first of all to thank Dr. Annie Poland of the American Jewish Historical Society for having devised this panel and invited us all to participate. And just this exceptional panel of world-class historians, Jonathan Sarna from Brandeis, Tony Michaels from the University of Wisconsin, and Lila Corwin-Berman from Temple University. And thanks to all of you for the great questions.
Thank you. And I want to I want to echo Sam's thanks to our panelists. It's very hard for historians to go on a stage and be asked to predict the future because it's not what they do. And they so gamely interrogated and looked at the ways anti-Semitism has been viewed and had a very civil discussion as well that I want to note. And I want to thank them for spending so much time working on this and continuing to work on this. I also want to say that one of the great things about the Center for Jewish History and the American Jewish Historical Society is that this is a place where we're able to bring scholars together to have these conversations, to have them engage with our archives and have them engage with you. So I want to invite you to come back. Not all our programs are about anti-Semitism, although we will be having one on May 7th with Eric Ward, who's been fighting white nationalism on the West Coast, who will be in conversation with Tony and Christina Greer from MSNBC. And then in the coming month, we'll be celebrating Women's History Month. We have a new blog with an interview with Alice Kessler Harris, the great women's historian, reflecting on her Jewish roots and ideas that you'll want to sign up for. So if you have a little card and we ask for your email, you'll get that. So please sign up for that. And I want to extend invitations to our programs. All of them are outside. And I want to extend an invitation for you to become part of this community, a community that challenges old ideas, looks to history, and understands the complexities both of history and the present. So please join our society. And much easier, I want to invite you to join us for a reception. That's easy. Cookies outside. And one last thing, if your name is Aliza Khazani, please report to the front desk. There is something you'll want at the front desk, Aliza Khazani. Thank you. Thank you very much to all of you.